They thought she was just another invisible janitor pushing a cleaning cart through the corridors of Eagle Point Military Academy. What they didn't know was that Captain Maya Ghost Parker had once been the most feared pilot in the skies, capable of vanishing from enemy radar like smoke in the wind. But when hostile aircraft filled the horizon that fateful morning, everyone would discover that legends don't retire. They just sweep floors until the world needs them again. The morning alarm at Eagle Point Military Academy pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 0430 hours. But Maya Parker had been awake for 30 minutes already. At 34, she had perfected the art of anticipating every sound, every movement, every potential threat. Habits that civilian life couldn't erase, no matter how many years passed. She pulled on her gray maintenance uniform, pinned her auburn hair into a tight bun, and laced up steel-toed boots that had replaced the flight boots she had once worn with pride. The academy sprawled across 2,000 acres of Montana wilderness, its imposing stone buildings and perfectly manicured grounds housing the next generation of military officers. Pine trees stretched toward the mountains beyond, their peaks still shrouded in morning mist. It was beautiful, peaceful, and exactly the kind of place where someone could disappear completely. Maya retrieved her cleaning cart from the utility closet, checking her supplies with the same methodical precision she had once used for pre-flight inspections. Industrial disinfectant, microfiber cloths, vacuum cleaner, trash bags. Tools of invisibility rather than warfare. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had gone from commanding a multi-million-dollar stealth fighter to commanding a mop bucket. The academy was already buzzing with activity as she began her rounds. Young cadets in crisp uniforms hurried between classes, their voices echoing through marble corridors lined with portraits of distinguished alumni. Fighter jets screamed overhead during training exercises, their engines creating sonic signatures that Maya could identify with startling accuracy. F-22 Raptors, F-35 Lightning IIs, even the occasional experimental aircraft that most people wouldn't recognize. Morning Ghost called out Cadet Tyler Brennan as he passed, using the nickname that had somehow stuck over her 3 years at the academy. The irony of the name made her smile bitterly. If only he knew how accurate it was. Captain Maya Ghost Parker had earned her call sign by being nearly impossible to track on radar, appearing and disappearing from enemy screens like a specter. She nodded politely and continued mopping, her movements efficient but unremarkable. That was the key to hiding in plain sight. Be competent enough to avoid criticism, but never so exceptional that anyone looked too closely. The officers' quarters required her attention next, and she knocked softly on each door before entering with her pass key. Most rooms were empty, their occupants already at morning briefings or flight training. But as she cleaned, Maya couldn't help noticing the technical manuals scattered across desks. Outdated tactical guides that hadn't been updated since her active duty days. The pilots were learning from books that contained information she had helped write, theories she had proven or disproven in actual combat. In Major Richardson's office, she paused while dusting his bookshelf. A framed photograph showed him standing proudly beside an F-16 Fighting Falcon, his chest puffed out with the confidence of someone who had logged significant flight hours. Respectable, certainly, but Maya had accumulated more combat flight time in 6 months than Richardson had in his entire 15-year career. Not that anyone would ever know. The Academy's trophy case drew her attention as she cleaned the main hallway. Awards for academic excellence, leadership, and military achievement filled the glass display. Her eyes lingered on a particular section dedicated to distinguished combat pilots, heroes whose names were publicly celebrated, whose accomplishments were taught in classrooms around the world. Her own achievements were locked away in classified files that would never see the light of day. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice belonged to instructor Captain Rebecca Torres, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s who taught advanced aeronautics. "Could you clean around the flight simulator room today? We're expecting VIP visitors this afternoon." "Of course, Captain," Maya replied, keeping her voice neutral and deferential. "I'll make sure everything's spotless." Torres nodded and walked away, But not before Maya caught her studying the tactical displays visible through the simulator room's windows. The scenarios being run were basic intercept patterns, the kind of exercises Maya could complete blindfolded while calculating fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure in her head. As she pushed her cart toward the simulator complex, Maya allowed herself a moment of nostalgia. The smell of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid that permeated the area was intoxicating, triggering memories of pre-dawn briefings, adrenaline-fueled dogfights, and the indescribable sensation of breaking the sound barrier while pulling 8GS in a combat turn. The cleaning closet near the simulator room had become her unofficial sanctuary over the years. Hidden behind industrial supplies and forgotten equipment, she kept a small radio tuned to air traffic control frequencies. As she worked, she listened to the constant chatter between tower control and training aircraft, her trained ear automatically cataloging aircraft types, flight patterns, and potential safety issues that the inexperienced controllers sometimes missed. Eagle Point Tower, this is Falcon Flight requesting clearance for formation training in Sector 7, crackled through the radio. Maya paused in her mopping, recognizing the voice of Lieutenant Commander Jackson Mills, one of the Academy's hotshot instructors. His flight pattern would take him directly over the mountains where atmospheric conditions could create dangerous wind shear, something the weather report had failed to mention, but that her years of experience recognized from subtle barometric pressure changes. She almost reached for the radio to warn them, then caught herself. Invisible janitors didn't offer tactical advice to experienced pilots. Instead, she returned to her mundane tasks, swallowing the knowledge that could save lives, maintaining the cover that had kept her safe, but slowly eaten away at her soul. Morning passed in routine tasks that masked extraordinary awareness. Every footstep in the corridor was cataloged and identified. Every aircraft overhead was recognized by engine signature alone. Every conversation overheard was analyzed for operational security implications that her former life had trained her to notice. By lunch break, Maya had cleaned 3 buildings, replaced 14 trash bags, and listened to 47 separate air traffic communications. She had also spotted 2 potential security vulnerabilities in the Academy's perimeter, identified a maintenance issue with one of the training aircraft based on an unusual engine sound, and mentally calculated that the fuel efficiency reports being filed by student pilots contained statistical impossibilities that suggested either equipment malfunction or falsified data. But none of that mattered. She was just the janitor, invisible and unremarkable, exactly as she had intended to be for the past 3 years. As she sat alone in the maintenance break room, eating a sandwich from a brown paper bag, Maya wondered how much longer she could maintain this charade. Every day brought fresh reminders of the skills she was wasting, the knowledge she was hiding, the lives she might save if she just had the courage to step out of the shadows. Staff Sergeant Patricia Reeves had seen enough military personnel come and go through Eagle Point to recognize when someone didn't fit their official profile. At 42, she had spent more than half her life in communications and intelligence support, developing an eye for the subtle details that separated trained operators from civilian contractors. And Maya Nightwind, despite her janitor's uniform and unremarkable paperwork, moved through the base with the unconscious situational awareness of someone who had been trained to survive in hostile environments. The first thing that caught Reeves' attention was the way Maya positioned herself during aircraft operations. Most civilian contractors instinctively moved away from active flight lines, intimidated by the noise and potential danger of military aircraft. Maya, however, seemed to anticipate aircraft movements, positioning herself in locations that provided optimal visibility while maintaining safe distances from jet blast zones. It was the kind of spatial intelligence that came from understanding aviation operations at a fundamental level. More telling was her reaction to emergency situations. 3 weeks earlier, when Lieutenant Foster had experienced a hydraulic malfunction during landing approach, most base personnel had gathered around the control tower to watch the drama unfold. Maya, however, had immediately moved to a position near the crash response vehicles, her body language tense with the kind of focused readiness that suggested she understood the severity of the situation better than the crowd of spectators. Reeves had been monitoring radio communications that day and noticed something else unusual. While Foster struggled with his malfunctioning aircraft, Maya had been standing near an open maintenance frequency radio. The emergency landing had been successful, but afterward Reeves realized that Maya had positioned herself where she could hear both air traffic control and emergency response communications. The observations accumulated over time like pieces of a complex puzzle. Reeves noticed that Maya seemed to know aircraft schedules better than some of the pilots themselves, arriving at specific hangars just before aircraft returned from missions. She had also observed Maya's unconscious habit of checking wind direction by observing flag movements and aircraft positioning, a behavior so automatic that it suggested years of aviation-related experience. Most compelling was an incident from the previous month when a new pilot had accidentally left his aircraft's weapons safety systems unlocked after a training exercise. Maya had been cleaning nearby and had quietly approached the crew chief to point out the oversight. The weapons specialist later mentioned to Reeves that the janitor had identified the problem using correct technical terminology, specifically referring to the master arm switch and weapon select panel rather than generic descriptions that a civilian might use. "There's something off about our ghost," Reeves confided to Master Sergeant Carlos Mendez during their weekly intelligence briefing. Mendez oversaw base security operations and had a reputation for taking personnel anomalies seriously. "I've been watching her for months, and she doesn't behave like a typical civilian contractor." Mendez looked up from his security reports with interest. At 38, he had learned to trust Reeves' instincts about personnel irregularities. Her background in communications intelligence had given her a trained eye for behavioral patterns that might indicate security concerns. "What kind of anomalies are we talking about?" "Movement patterns, situational awareness, technical knowledge," Reeves replied, consulting her notes. "She positions herself like someone with tactical training. She understands aircraft operations better than she should, and she's got the kind of hypervigilance that comes from combat experience." Mendez frowned as he considered the implications. Background checks for civilian contractors were supposed to be thorough, but budgetary constraints and personnel shortages sometimes led to abbreviated screening processes. The possibility that someone with undisclosed military experience had slipped through the system was concerning from a security perspective. "Have you reviewed her personnel file?" Mendez asked, already reaching for his secure terminal to access the base's human resources database. "That's the interesting part," Reeves said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who had discovered a significant inconsistency. "Her file is remarkably thin for someone who has been working here for 3 years. Basic contact information, employment history showing various janitorial positions, standard security clearance documentation. But there's something missing." Mendez pulled up Maya's file on his screen and scrolled through the available information. The documentation appeared complete at first glance. Background check, references, employment verification. But as he read more carefully, he began to understand Reeves' concerns. "Look at the employment gaps," Reeves continued, pointing to specific dates in the chronology. "She's got a 2-year period where the file shows private contractor work with no specific employer listed. Then there's an 8-month gap with no employment information at all. More suspicious was the reference information. Maya's previous employers were all listed as companies that specialized in defense contractor services. But when Mendez cross-referenced them with the Pentagon's contractor database, several of the businesses appear to be shell companies or had ceased operations shortly after the dates listed in her file. "Could be innocent," Mendez said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Defense contractors come and go pretty regularly. Budget cuts, contract completions, corporate restructuring. But you're right that it's a pattern worth investigating." Reeves had saved her most compelling observation for last. "There's one more thing. I've been monitoring her behavior during our weekly air defense drills. When the alarm sounds, most civilians either panic or look around for guidance from military personnel. Maya doesn't. She immediately assesses aircraft positioning, checks for secure hangar access, and positions herself near emergency communication equipment. It's automatic like muscle memory. The implication hung in the air between them. Military personnel were trained to respond to emergency situations with specific protocols, but those responses became instinctive only after extensive repetition under realistic conditions. Civilian contractors might know the basic procedures, but they wouldn't demonstrate the kind of automatic response patterns that Reeves had observed. I think she's former military, Reeves concluded. Possibly special operations or intelligence services. The question is why she's hiding it and whether her presence here represents a security risk. Mendez leaned back in his chair, processing the information. The possibility that they had an undisclosed former military operator working as a janitor raised numerous questions about motives, clearance levels, and potential security implications. If Maya was hiding a military background, it could indicate anything from personal reasons to active intelligence gathering for hostile parties. "What's your recommendation?" he asked, though he was already formulating his own plan of action. "Discreet surveillance and background verification," Reeves replied immediately. "I want to monitor her behavior more systematically, document any additional anomalies, and request a deeper background investigation through military intelligence channels. If she's who I think she might be, we need to know before something happens that puts base security at risk." Mendez nodded grimly. The conversation had confirmed his own growing suspicions about their mysterious janitor. Too many small details added up to a pattern that suggested Maya Nightwind was far more than she appeared to be. The question was whether she represented an opportunity or a threat, and whether they would discover the truth before circumstances forced her to reveal her real capabilities. The crisis began at 0647 hours on a Tuesday morning when the base's primary air traffic control system experienced a catastrophic failure during the busiest flight operations window of the week. Technical specialist Jennifer Walsh stared at her blank radar screens in growing panic as 12 aircraft, including a formation of F-22 Raptors returning from a dawn patrol mission, suddenly disappeared from her displays. "Control tower, this is Falcon Leader," Captain Hawthorne's voice crackled through the radio with obvious concern. "We're showing no radar contact with base operations, requesting immediate guidance for landing approach." Walsh's hands flew over her control panel, desperately attempting to restart the system that had been functioning perfectly just minutes earlier. The backup radar showed only intermittent contacts, creating a dangerous situation where multiple aircraft were approaching the same airspace without proper coordination, with visibility reduced by morning fog and multiple flight paths converging on Eagle Point's single runway. "All aircraft, this is Control," Walsh broadcast, her voice tight with stress. "We're experiencing primary radar failure. Maintain current altitude and establish visual separation. Do not approach for landing until further notice." The response from the airborne pilots was immediate and alarmed. 12 highly trained aviators were now flying in potentially overlapping flight paths with only voice communication and limited visual contact to prevent catastrophic accidents. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Nash, the base operations commander, arrived in the control tower within minutes of being notified about the crisis. At 45, she had seen enough emergency situations to recognize when standard procedures weren't going to be sufficient. The radar system failure had occurred at the worst possible time, during peak operations when a margin for error was minimal. "What's our status on backup systems?" Nash demanded as she surveyed the situation. "Backup radar is operational, but showing significant gaps in coverage," reported Senior Airman David Kim, the tower's most experienced technician. "We can track aircraft intermittently, but not with sufficient accuracy for safe landing operations. The primary system appears to have suffered a complete processor failure." Nash grabbed the radio microphone. "All aircraft, this is base operations. We're implementing emergency protocols. Falcon formation, you have priority for emergency landing. All other aircraft divert to alternate airfields per your flight plans." The decision was tactically sound, but operationally disastrous. Diverting aircraft to other bases would create logistical nightmares, delayed mission schedules, and potential security complications. As the crisis unfolded, Maya had been methodically cleaning the administrative offices adjacent to the control tower. The raised voices and urgent radio chatter had drawn her attention, and she had positioned herself near the communications equipment room, where she could monitor the situation without being noticed. Her trained ear immediately recognized the severity of the emergency. Multiple aircraft in distress with degraded ground control capabilities. Through the open doorway, she could see the control tower personnel struggling with equipment that she recognized from her previous life. The radar system was a military-standard NFPS 117 configuration, a sophisticated but temperamental piece of technology that she had worked with extensively during her years as a combat pilot. The technical problem was obvious to anyone with advanced training in military radar systems. The primary processor had locked up due to a software conflict between the tracking algorithm and the weather radar integration system. It was a known issue that could be resolved in minutes with the right technical knowledge. But the base's IT specialists were following standard troubleshooting procedures that would take hours to complete. Maya found herself facing the same moral dilemma that had ended her previous career. She could maintain her cover and allow the situation to escalate, potentially resulting in aircraft accidents and pilot casualties, or she could intervene with knowledge that would immediately reveal her true background and destroy the carefully constructed anonymity that had protected her for 3 years. The decision was made for her when Falcon Leader's voice cut through the radio chatter with barely controlled desperation. "Control, we're showing fuel warnings. We need immediate landing clearance, or we're looking at emergency ejection in 12 minutes. Maya abandoned her cleaning cart and walked directly into the control tower, her movement purposeful and confident in a way that immediately drew attention from the frantic technicians. "Ma'am, you can't be in here during emergency operations," Walsh said firmly. "This is a restricted area. The radar failure is caused by a processor lockup in the weather integration module," Maya replied calmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood exactly what she was discussing. "You can restore primary function by isolating the weather radar feed and reinitializing the tracking algorithms through the backup processor." The control room fell silent except for the continued radio chatter from the circling aircraft. Walsh stared at Maya with amazement and confusion, unable to process how a janitor could possibly know the technical specifications of their radar system. "That's not possible," Kim stammered. "The system architecture is classified. Civilian contractors don't have access to technical manuals for this equipment." Maya moved to the primary console and began entering commands with the fluid precision of someone who had performed the same procedures hundreds of times. Her fingers moved across the interface without hesitation, accessing diagnostic modes and system controls that weren't documented in basic operator manuals. "Stop," Nash commanded, but her voice carried uncertainty rather than authority. The woman operating their controls clearly knew exactly what she was doing, and with 12 aircraft in potential danger, Nash was reluctant to interrupt a solution that might actually work. The radar display flickered twice, then suddenly blazed alive with perfect clarity. 12 aircraft contacts appeared in precise formation, their identification tags displaying correct altitude, heading, and fuel status information. The system was functioning better than it had in months, with resolution and tracking accuracy that exceeded normal operational parameters. "How did you?" Walsh began, but her question was interrupted by an immediate flood of radio transmissions from relieved pilots who could suddenly see their positions relative to each other and the runway. "Control, this is Falcon Leader. We're showing full radar contact, requesting immediate landing clearance." "Cleared for approach. Falcon formation," Walsh responded automatically, her eyes still fixed on Maya with a mixture of gratitude and deep suspicion. Lieutenant Colonel Nash stepped closer to Maya, her expression shifting from crisis management to intense scrutiny. "Miss Nightwind, I think we need to have a conversation about your technical qualifications." Maya realized that her carefully maintained cover had just evaporated in the span of 5 minutes. The knowledge she had displayed wasn't something that could be explained away as casual familiarity or lucky guessing. She had just demonstrated expert-level understanding of classified military systems, and there was no innocent explanation for that level of expertise. "Ma'am, I just helped resolve an emergency situation," Maya replied carefully, trying to maintain some semblance of her janitor persona, even though she knew it was too late. "You did a lot more than help," Nash said grimly. "You just displayed technical knowledge that requires years of specialized training and security clearances that your personnel file says you don't possess." As the aircraft began their safe landing approaches, the immediate crisis was over. But for Maya, a much more dangerous situation was just beginning. Her moment of conscience had saved lives and revealed capabilities that would now require explanations she wasn't prepared to give. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Nash's office felt smaller than usual when Maya entered at 1,400 hours sharp, escorted by Master Sergeant Mendez and Staff Sergeant Reeves. The walls were lined with commendations, photographs of aircraft formations, and a massive American flag that seemed to cast everything in red, white, and blue shadows. Nash sat behind her desk with 3 manila folders spread before her. One containing Maya's official personnel file, another marked with classification stamps that made Maya's pulse quicken, and a third that appeared to contain handwritten notes and photographs. "Sit down, Miss Nightwind," Nash said without looking up from the documents, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had spent 22 years in the Air Force and had learned to recognize when situations weren't what they appeared to be. Maya remained standing, her janitorial uniform feeling increasingly inadequate in the formal military environment. "Ma'am, if this is about this morning's incident with the radar system, I was simply trying to help resolve an emergency situation. This isn't about helping." Nash finally looked up, her gray eyes sharp with a kind of scrutiny that made seasoned officers uncomfortable. "This is about how a civilian janitor demonstrated expert-level knowledge of classified military radar systems. Knowledge that requires years of specialized training and security clearances that your file indicates you don't possess." Mendez stepped forward, consulting a tablet containing what appeared to be a comprehensive incident report. "Nightwind, the technical procedures you used this morning aren't documented in any manual available to civilian contractors. The diagnostic commands you entered require administrative-level access that's restricted to qualified military technicians with top-secret clearances." Maya kept her expression neutral, though internally she was calculating exit strategies and assessing the potential consequences of various responses. "I've always been good with electronics, sir. Sometimes you can figure out solutions by observing patterns and trying different approaches." Reeves interjected, her communications background evident in her direct approach to analyzing deception. "I've been monitoring your behavior for months. You don't move like a civilian contractor. You don't react to emergency situations like someone with basic training, and you sure as hell don't possess the kind of technical knowledge you displayed this morning through casual observation." Nash leaned back in her chair, studying Maya's face with the practiced eye of someone who had conducted hundreds of personnel interviews. "Miss Nightwind, I've been in the Air Force for over 2 decades. I've seen every kind of cover story, every type of deception, and every variety of half-truth that people use to hide their real backgrounds. You're not lying to me about specific facts. You're concealing something much more significant." Before Maya could respond, the office door opened and a figure in civilian clothes entered carrying a briefcase marked with classification levels that made everyone in the room straighten instinctively. The man was in his 50s with the bearing of career intelligence services and the kind of face that suggested he had seen classified information that would never be publicly acknowledged. "Colonel Nash," the newcomer said, presenting credentials that Nash examined carefully before nodding with obvious respect. "I'm Agent Michael Harrison, Defense Intelligence Agency. I'm here regarding Ms. Nightwind's background verification." Maya felt her carefully constructed world beginning to collapse with military precision. The involvement of the Defense Intelligence Agency meant that her situation had escalated far beyond base-level personnel concerns. DI agents didn't investigate civilian janitors unless those janitors had backgrounds that intersected with national security interests. After thorough investigation and revelation of her true identity as Captain Maya Ghost Parker, a legendary special operations pilot presumed dead after classified missions, Maya was offered choice. She could return to her janitorial duties with her cover permanently blown, or accept a position training the next generation of pilots at Eagle Point Military Academy. 6 months later, Colonel Maya Parker stood before 24 of the most promising pilot candidates in the United States Air Force Academy, her silver eagles gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The promotion had come with her new assignment, recognition that her combat experience and demonstrated capabilities warranted the rank and authority necessary to reshape how the Air Force trained its future combat pilots. The ghost had finally stepped out of the shadows.